In 1896, Lord Alfred Douglas wrote in his poem Two Loves, "I am the love that dare not speak its name." The phrase, "the love that dare not speak its name," has become a euphemism for homosexuality, and gay pride movements have built up around naming that love and seeking recognition for those who desire it. Coming out, in other words, naming oneself as a homosexual is part of that strategy. A politics of identity has galvanised around recognition, both visible and juridical. That is, recognition within the law. This has manifested itself in all aspects of cultural and political life, and the slogan of AIDS activism, "Silence equals death," with its evocation to speak up and to speak out about sexuality, can be seen as part of this project. And yet, in the midst of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, in 1991, the Melbourne artist and activist Matthew Jones made the following statement within a work that he called "Silence Equals Death," and it was on show at the Gertrude Street Gallery here in Melbourne. And so within this work appeared this statement: "We rally to the slogan because they have forced us to, but keep the silence as a place where we refuse to use their terms." Now, in a somewhat roundabout way tonight, my lecture on the work of Judith Butler tries to make sense of these seemingly contradictory positions. On the one hand, the liberating act of naming oneself as a homosexual, of being out and proud, and on the other hand, a retreat into silence as an equally liberating space. Now, it was in the middle of last year that Ghassan Haj launched the idea of this Key Thinkers series, and he sent an email around to university staff asking for nominations of intellectuals whose body of research warranted their inclusion. To name key thinkers. Did my nomination of Judith Butler alone make her a key thinker? Well, no. Had I nominated a newspaper columnist, the same effect would not have been achieved. The mere act of nominating would not itself have bestowed upon Kate Langbroek, or even Miff Warhurst, the status of key thinker. But Judith Butler had a track record, some prior performances of the types of things that are expected of key thinkers. What is it to be a key thinker? What is it to be an intellectual? What is it to be a homosexual? What is it to be a woman? What is it to be named as anything? And these are the sort of questions that Judith Butler has addressed in the course of her intellectual inquiries since the late 1980s. In what has been a relatively short period, her work has been prolific, interdisciplinary and enormously influential in both academic circles and beyond. And she is currently the Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. But it's arguably her work on gender that has attracted the most popular attention. And if one can consider the level of activity on Wikipedia as an index of sorts of the influence of her writings, then it is notable that the most prominent texts, those which have acquired the attribution major works, are those that predominantly engage with questions of gender and sexuality. And so it's on this area that I'm going to focus tonight. But underlying this work, and infusing Butler's entire body of work, is the fundamental question of what constitutes a human life. And perhaps more particularly, what constitutes a recognisable life. In other words, what lives are recognised and valorised, and what are the structures through which this occurs. In more recent work, Butler has argued that the current US-led wars have produced a distinction between lives that are recognisable and as grievable and those that are not. Butler asks what claims to citizenship might be recognised and on what terms. And she has spoken evocatively about the way in which the lives of Palestinian children and civilians are rendered invisible as lives that do not count. The enthusiasm with which Butler's writing on gender, drag and concepts of queer have been received provides clear evidence of the relationship between academic practices and the circulation of ideas beyond the academy. And it's certainly tempting to see the fluctuating boundaries and the ever-changing nomenclature of the gay and lesbian communities over the past 2 decades as in some way reflecting the influence of Butler's works. And yet these are not always the sorts of influences that she has desired. As identity lists grow and the concept of inclusivity requires more and more identity categories. And so we see gay and lesbian, transsexual, transgender and bisexual community and communities being named and rights and identities being proclaimed. Now, this influence between Butler's work and the community has not been a one-way influence, for her writings have emerged from her own experiences of moving in these communities, and revisions of her work have been prompted and engaged by and engaged with the ways in which her ideas circulated within and were adopted by the gay and lesbian communities. Now, this sort of rapid transmission and take-up of Butler's work and their incorporation into forms of political activism has not been without its problems, and Butler has at times seemed almost taken aback by the extent and the enthusiasm with which her writings have been adopted and, as she perceives to have been misunderstood, as advocating a specific form of political engagement, some sort of step-by-step instruction for political activism. Now, she rejects this idea that she's written any sort of manifesto. In fact, quite the reverse. Her writing is in many ways not really conducive to the reduction to a sort of manifesto of action. And indeed, her continual project might be seen as being one of complication. It really involves taking what might be seen as taken for given positions to be fundamental assumptions and then revealing them as being anything but. And really, for this reason, and for others, her work is regarded as somewhat difficult. Now, difficult can have several implications. Let's see, what have I got here? Now, difficult, certainly her writing is difficult, and she has spoken of the hard labour that is involved in intellectual inquiry. It is difficult for another reason, and that is because it is not always easy to find a language, a way of writing that will enable one to challenge concepts and ideas that have previously been taken for granted. So Butler's writing, I think, is sort of incredibly complex and at times dense and seemingly circular, because much of the time she's grasping for a way of talking about things which she wants to, in a way that dislodges the conventional way of understanding these concepts, and particularly concepts of gender and sex and sexuality. So the language fails her at times in these attempts, inevitably will fail her. But her work is difficult really in yet another way, because it functions as an irritant, as a challenge to rethink our identity claims and to accept an undoing of self. For there are no simple binaries in Butler's writing, there's no male or female, no masculine or feminine, or for that matter, no gay or straight. Why then do these difficult writings have such appeal? And I want to suggest really it's for the same reason. That because for all of their difficulty, Butler is creating a space, or attempting to create a space in her writing for those who do not fit into the taken for granted nature of these binaries. Butler's striving for a language to speak of the unspeakable is one that clearly resonates with those whose inability to find a voice in an identity-based social system renders them silent. So for tonight I really want to draw on two works in particular of Judith Butler's, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter, and also a later work, Undoing Gender, and address a number of questions, primarily these three. How is it that sex is regarded as a natural phenomenon and only gender then as a cultural construction? How are sex and gender done to us and by us, and can we do them differently? And then really following up my own particular interest in identity politics, and in particular the way in which images of identity politics both play into these processes and also try to undo them. Okay, so written in the early 1990s, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity appeared at a time when the very category of woman had become less than robust. On this campus, discussions were being held as to whether entry into the women's room, a woman-only space, should become restricted to women who were born women. The Michigan Women's Music Festival was confronted with whether it would allow male to female transsexuals to attend. At the same time, some women-born women were feeling alienated from what were presumed to be the universal nature of women's concerns. And many lesbians were wondering whether they were indeed women. And indeed, Monique Wittig in 1970 had made the radical statement that lesbians are not women, meaning it in a radical, provocative sense. So it was not Butler who first troubled the term woman. In fact, it was already and always under considerable stress. In Australia in 1988, writing in Art Monthly, Janine Burke had observed with some dismay the lack of a visible feminist we in the art world. There was no women's art movement anymore, no longer one uniting vision. Now, this view had been formed when Janine Burke was attending the Women's Dinner, an event that coincided with the exhibition of Judy Chicago's artwork, The Dinner Party, which some of you may be familiar with. The Dinner Party is an enormous installation work of art. It consists of a equilateral triangle with 13 place settings on each of the three sides, at which are laid crockery, runners, I can't remember whether there's cutlery, and these 39 places represent 39 women who are either historical or mythological figures, and they're chosen for their actual accomplishments or their legendary powers. So this humongous piece of work, which was first made in 1980, was shown in... Oh no, it was actually 1979 it was first shown. It was shown in Melbourne in the bicentenary year at the exhibition buildings. Now, despite claims that the images, and that is the crockery, and the various representations of these 39 women, despite the claims that these were not literal, but rather a blending of historic fact, iconographical sources, symbolic meaning and imagination, there was a strong labial influence in the form of the crockery, one that relied upon the notion of a shared biological status of the category of women. And, of course, a number of commentators have criticised this work for its aesthetics of essentialising women. Terry Smith, and these are Australian writers writing in 1988 when the project was on display here. Terry Smith characterised Chicago's project as seeking to substitute a consummate statement of womanness for the driving masculinity of most art pieces. Now, you know, many would say, well, what's wrong with that? And indeed, I mean, that was really Judy Chicago's project, was to actually draw attention to the existence of female artists and also their absence in most exhibitions at the time. Jill Carrick argued that Chicago's sense of the subject was one of unified, centralised subjectivity, unproblematic and whole. Indeed, Chicago describes the work as enabling the viewer, and we presume here, we presume she to mean the female viewer, to understand their personal experience as part of a larger, universal female experience. Now, as I indicated at the outset, civil rights movements more generally have been motivated to name identities that have been the subject of discrimination, with the understanding that visibility and recognition in language is part of full citizenship, a necessary precursor perhaps to full citizenship. Naming and the use of representational forms deemed to be female then were fundamental strategies in Judy Chicago's work. And in a speech that she gave at the Women's Dinner, this same Women's Dinner that prompted Janine Burke's melancholic reflection, Chicago asserted that art is important for the feminist project because that which is not imaged remains unclear to us, cloudy and unidentified. So Judy Chicago's work was very much a form of identity politics in the way in which it relied upon naming these 39 women, and I think another 500 or 999 women's names were incorporated into tiles on the floor. So in naming these women and making visible and seeking recognition for these otherwise absent women in art history, she sought to achieve the place of these women and, by extension, all women in the historical record. So it's against this sort of feminist politics which Judith Butler, it was against this background of feminist politics that Judith Butler conceived of the book Gender Trouble. And she described her motivations in these words. it seemed to me, and continues to seem, that feminism ought to be careful not to idealise certain expressions of gender that in turn produce new forms of hierarchy and exclusion. In particular, I opposed those regimes of truth that stipulated that certain kinds of gendered expressions were found to be false or derivative and others true and original. Now, the formulation of woman as a social construction is, of course, not new, and Butler engages in detail with Simone de Beauvoir's now classic formulation that one is not born a woman, but rather one becomes one. Asserting, then, that biology was not destiny, the women's movement has sought to change the social structures which produced a particular sort of womanhood. Much of women's activism relies upon the notion that their common cause arises from being biologically female. That is the sort of the binding essence of much of women's feminist projects. And their political program then is to ensure that this biological shared biology does not give rise to discrimination or less of a life, that their biology is not their destiny. Gender is regarded in this formulation then not so much as what one is, but what one does. So sex being biological, gender then being the cultural expressions of sex. Okay, so in Butler's Gender Trouble then, she focuses more on gender than sex, although really what she does is fundamentally question this distinction between sex as being biology and gender as being cultural, and wants to raise the question as to whether sex itself is culturally constructed. And so more critical really in terms of where Butler's work would take her was the influence of Denise Riley's 1988 book entitled Am I That Name? Subheaded Feminism and the Category of Women in History. For Judith, Butler had something far more radical in mind when she set out to trouble gender. And as I suggested, it was not really to equalise the treatment of the two sexes, nor to assert their inherent difference, but rather to dismantle the category of woman altogether, and to query or queer the notion that sex is a biological fact. But having done that, she perhaps moves rather too swiftly on. In Gender Trouble, Butler assembles an argument that the imposition of the sex binary of male and female is an habitual and violent presumption about what constitutes a legitimate life and a legitimate body. Her argument is then based on the premise that our status as a social being, that is, as opposed to our physical body or as an object or as I suppose as an animal, that our status as a social being is achieved through language. Language is really the means through which we are brought into the world. And Butler adds then that this status as a social being then is denied to those who do not fall within the gender norms imposed by language. In other words, it is impossible to function in the world without being named or claiming the name of male or female. And it is this that troubled Butler. And she set out to open up possibilities for those who did not feel that these terms, male and female, and all that they encompassed, were sufficient for their own expressions of sex and sexuality. Now, in answer to the question, sort of what's at stake here, or why bother, there are numbers of people who have in fact questioned the usefulness of this project as a project that merely opens up possibilities. Some have questioned it really quite virulently. To which Butler has replied with the following. Oh, I've got a slide of this. No, that's not it. Anyone who has understood what it is to live in the social world as what is deemed by language as impossible, illegible, unrealisable, unreal and illegitimate will understand the importance of opening up the possibilities of gender. I'll just read that again. I thought I had it up there, but I won't flick around. So the importance of Butler's project, she states as being, anyone who has understood what it is to live in the social world as what is deemed by language as impossible, illegible, unrealisable, unreal and illegitimate will understand the importance of opening up the possibilities of gender. So to illustrate what it means to be deemed by language as impossible, Butler describes the anxiety that arises when bodies do not comply with the strict male-female binaries. This anxiety stems from it not being possible with any certainty to, as she puts it, read the body that one sees. Now, in a child, this anxiety will prompt the question, are you a man or a woman? In adulthood, this anxiety of not being able to read or misreading the body that one sees can produce more aggressive reactions. By proclaiming sex to be biological and only gender to be cultural, we are assuming that the binary of sex, the very state of maleness and femaleness, exists then in the pre-linguistic realm, prior to language, and that there is a baby girl there waiting to be named as such. But Butler wants to argue that there is no sex that has itself not already been produced by language. And here Butler draws on Foucault. And in the following paragraph, sort of in some ways summarises where we're up to now. Where feminist analysis takes the category of sex, and thus the binary restriction on gender as its point of departure, Foucault argues that his own project, and one now that Butler shares really, is an inquiry into how the category of sex and sexual differences are constructed within discourse as necessary features of bodily identity. In other words, Butler's project is an anti-essentialist project and is founded on the notion that the binary of sex is a constructed categorisation as opposed to naturally occurring. In making this proposal, Butler refers to material evidence of the insufficiency of the binary categories of male and female bodies. She cites examples of bodies that are not immediately categorisable within the male-female binary. Or to place her conclusions in a more clinical language, the morphology of external genitalia does not provide a clear-cut delineation of the differences between the sexes. So clearly there are bodies that exceed, that cannot be accommodated within the sex binary of male and female. Butler argues that in effect it is these categories, these two categories of male and female, that regulate what is acceptable as a human body, what can be brought into the social sphere. Now we may accept that there are biological differences between bodies, and Butler does, but she argues that not all women's bodies, and most of these turn on reproduction, let's say. So Butler argues that really not all women's bodies can be impregnated. There are female children and infants. There are old women who cannot be impregnated. In fact, it is likely that for more of our lives rather than less, this supposedly foundational difference is somewhat moot. And even if it were not, why is this the basis for an entire set of gender norms? So when Butler wrote of the violence of language, she refers to the way in which it denies certain people the right to existence in the social sphere. For one is required to be deemed male or female in order to safely circulate. And then, of course, though, there is the very real violence that has occurred to those who are born with insufficiently pronounced genitalia to enable the swift declaration of their sex. So that sort of moment when in the hospital perhaps or elsewhere where the person delivering the baby sort of pauses for rather too long. And then the operations that have been done, not to correct the gender, but the sex of this child. So it is this that allows Butler to claim that perhaps after all, gender is sex and sex is gender, and that neither of the two are natural. It is the mark of sex, the naming of the newborn as a boy or a girl, that qualifies the body as a human body. In Butler's words, the moment in which an infant is humanised is when the question, is it a boy or girl, is answered. Okay, so in this sense then, Butler wants to argue that the questions of sex and gender are what she describes as performative, that the statement, it's a boy or it's a girl, functions as a performative in that the statement, it's a boy or a girl, does what it says. The boy or girl is created by the act of naming them as such. This term performative then, as employed by Butler, draws on the concept of performative utterances. And in a very broad sort of and perhaps contestable sense, performative utterances are statements, as I said, that do what they say, that are not really subject to truth claims. They are more, they bring into being what they say. So the notion of performativity then is one of the areas where Butler's writing has required clarification in subsequent texts, and she accepts some responsibility for this because she introduced the term in the context of a discussion of drag performances and sort of, I suppose, brought up a very familiar sense of the term performance and led to confusion between this notion of performance as something that one might just come out and do, as opposed to the performative utterance, which is more accurately done to us. So she then... So this idea that this misreading, let's say, of Butler and performativity conveyed the impression that one could go out and perform knowingly acts of gender. But as Butler emphasises, there is actually no one that is carrying out these acts. It is actually in the acts of gender that one is constituted. And these acts of performativity are really a set of repeated acts within a highly regulatory frame. There's only certain acceptable acts that are going to give rise to an acceptable expression of gender. And it is within these repeated acts that we are incorporated into the regimes of gender and the social order. And incorporated, meaning here, literally the coming into being. The body being incorporated or made visible and viable within the social order occurs through the performativity of gender, the naming of the male and female. So just using an analogy, we speak of the incorporation of a company, the bringing into being of a company. This requires a number of actions through which an entity, which is not yet an entity in the eyes of the law, becomes a company. These actions, the requirements of incorporation, are performed according to a set of legal rules. Once these activities have been performed, the entity is named a company. It has come into being and it can function in the world of commerce and law. Similarly, Butler argues that the body of an infant is drawn into the social order through the performative act of declaring its sex, and must then continue to be drawn into being through the set of acts that are available to it within a broader social structure. In the case of gender and sex, then, the law is partly the law of the land, but it is also the norms, codes of behaviour and implicit contracts that we accept when we circulate in society. So in contrast to the incorporation of the company, where its status as a company is constituted once and for all, or at least until bankruptcy or dissolution, in this act of incorporation, the gendering process is not a once and for all act, but a sense of repeated acts, a set of repeated acts, as if we are constituted and reconstituted each time we enter the social order. And the social order, I suppose, I sort of tend to just think as at which time we engage with another. We engage with we might just be mooching about at home. As soon as we sort of enter into some relation with another, or be they a person or institution, we become constituted in the social order and will inevitably will be required to be male or female.